Hi, I'm Marcus Weaver-Hightower. I want to talk to you today about some important terms that we use in gender and sexuality studies. I'm specifically interested in the terms that we use when we're doing gender and sexuality studies in education. The first term that we'll oftentimes come across is sex. Now, I don't mean the act of sex between two people. I mean one's sex. Take a second, if you would, and kind of just jot down what you think might be the definition of sex. What is sex? So I hope you've had a chance to pause the video and maybe write down a quick reflection. The first thing that you'll probably have said, hopefully, is that sex is the biological characteristics of someone on a spectrum between male and female. And we'll talk about those things as being on a spectrum in just a minute. But remember, when we talk about sex, what we mean are biological characteristics. Very important. So things like whether you have a penis or a vagina, whether you have estrogen or testosterone or some mixture in between those things. The term that we often have confused for sex is gender. What exactly is gender and how is it potentially different from sex? So maybe pause the video again and just write down what you think gender is talking about. Well, hopefully you've had a chance to write down your definition. What did you come up with? Well, gender, if it's not the biological, which is sex, must refer to social. So gender is the social construction of the biological components. So if you were born with male genitalia, male hormones, male chromosomes, all those kinds of things, you can act male, and that would be your gender. So it would be things like your appearance, your demonstration of gender, your interactions with others, all carry gendered valences. So for instance, one of our gender issues in Western society and in many other societies is hair length. We tend to have females with longer hair than males. Now that's not always been the case historically. So gender is one of those things that can change from society to society. Biological sex is one that tends to be fixed with one's biology. Gender changes from culture to culture. So sex versus gender, what is it that's going to be different there? Well, sex, as I said before, is biologically fixed. It's determined by things that are outside of the individual's control. Gender, on the other hand, is what society makes of those sex differences. So whether or not you have a penis or a vagina or a Y chromosome makes a difference in how you're treated by others and what kinds of things you get to do within society. It's not necessarily that your biology is holding you back, it's social forces that are holding you back. That is gender. Now, it's really crucial in research to make that distinction between sex and gender. So if you ask on a survey, for instance, what someone's sex is, they should be able to say male, female, or intersexed. I'll tell you what intersexed is in just a minute, but in general, sex are those biological characteristics, so it should be male or female. Gender, on the other hand, you would only ask if you are looking for how someone behaves in public, behaves within their society. So instead of male or female, what you're looking for is masculine or feminine. So that terminology difference is really, really crucial to make, because you can really misunderstand and misrepresent the things that you found if you confuse those two terms. So as I said, male and female, are characteristics or labels that we use when we're talking about sex. Biological. Is someone male? Is someone female? And there's a wide spectrum between those two things that we can talk about in terms of biology, because biology isn't as simple as, you were born exactly male or born exactly female. So we'll talk a little bit about the complications of that in just a minute. But these two terms are when we're talking about sex. The terms that we use when we're talking about gender are masculinity and femininity. Within a culture, the things that men are thought to do are considered masculine. The things that women are thought to do are considered feminine. So if we're talking about gender, say on a survey, don't ask someone's gender and then list male or female, list masculine or feminine instead. So if we go back to looking at sex, what are the kinds of things that determines what one's sex is? And this is where it starts to get a little bit complicated about how we determine sex. Too often we think that there's just a binary. There's male and female, penis, vagina, Y chromosome, 2 X chromosomes. But it's really much more complicated than that. So external genitalia is one way that we determine a sex, and for the most part, that is the primary way that we talk about what someone's sex is. So whether they have a penis or they have a vulva, that's where we start from the very first moment when you come out of the mother's womb. That's where we start thinking about what a male is versus a female. Gonads are another thing. On the male, those are external, right, with testicles. For a female, though, the ovaries are the gonads. So they're very similar in terms of producing reproductive cells, but they're located in different places. And again, there's kind of a wide range of how those gonads may function, where they are in the body, and oftentimes even there's pieces of each one within a single individual. Chromosomes. Do you have 2 X chromosomes or do you have an X and Y chromosome? Sometimes those chromosomes may have some abnormalities within particular individuals, which can make sex, one's biological sex, a little bit more complicated than just simply one or the other, a binary choice between male and female. Of course, there's secondary sex characteristics, things like breast size, things like pubic hair, other sorts of secondary sex characteristics like lip size, those kinds of things that are related to sex and that have tendencies towards one sex or another, but there's wide ranges again in between all of those things. Hormones, lots of different hormones that can be sex related. Particularly we often think of estrogen and testosterone that would determine whether you're male or female, but there's a lot of mixing in there. Women have testosterone in their bodies, and the extent to which they have testosterone can vary based on a lot of things. Brain structure. Sexes have different brain structures, different tendencies towards brain structures. Now the thing to remember is that not that there's a male brain and a female brain and that there's nothing in between. These brain structures and the sort of gender differences between them are very, very small. And oftentimes, because they're so small, you can have a female who has a very male brain structure and a male who has a very female brain structure. So this is not just sort of a two-choice kind of system, but there's actually a lot of variance in between. Muscle mass is another. In general, and on average, males have a higher large muscle mass, with the large muscles, things like your quads and your legs, biceps and triceps and those kinds of things. Females have more fine muscle mass. So things like finger control and those kinds of things. But again, these differences between males and females are so minute that it's really difficult to make a distinction based solely on those muscle masses. Hair patterns, you'll see that my hair pattern is a very male kind of hair pattern. Males tend to have more hair on their bodies than females, but of course the bearded lady in the circus shows and those kinds of things shows that you can be female and have a very male kind of hair pattern, and vice versa. And finally, vocal range. Most human beings can make a very wide vocal range. If you think about men who sing in falsetto, they can get their voices very, very high. And there are women, of course, who can get their voices very, very low. But on average, as we look between the two sexes, there's a vocal range difference with females being able to speak and sing at a higher register than males. Now, I said that there's a lot of in between. There's a term that we use for individuals who have characteristics that are kind of in between the sort of stereotypical male versus the stereotypical female. And that term is intersex. In years past, it may have been called hermaphrodite. That term is not used anymore. It is considered actually quite vulgar. So intersex is the term that we use now. Between male and female, there's a broad range, even in things like external genitalia. So anything between a vulva and a penis can occur and has occurred. You can look some photographs and diagrams up. Anything from a mild hypospadias, which is the urethra opening on the penis, can be anywhere from past what you would say is sort of the front tip of the penis, all the way down the shaft of the penis, and down even further, anywhere from there into what would look like a vagina, and in some cases, actually, external genitalia that has the appearance of having both of those different sets. So again, between male and female, there is a spectrum. And you can be anywhere on that spectrum between male and female, closer to female, closer to male, but there's a broad variety. So even the thing, again, that we think is very fixed by biology, things that are outside the individual's control, can be very different as we look across different people. Okay, so what if we turn to gender? So we've talked about the biological. What is it that determines someone's gender? Well, one thing can be the sex assigned at birth. So you come from your mother's womb, the doctor holds you up, he sees a penis, he says, okay, it's a male. He sees a vulva, okay, it's a female. But again, even for doctors, there's sometimes a difficulty being able to distinguish between those two binary choices. Sometimes those decisions are made for intersex people based on what they more look like. But whatever that sex is that you're assigned at birth, oftentimes will translate into what your gender is. That's what we call cisgender, and that term will come up a little bit later, but it's basically the phenotypical biological sex that you have is also the gender that you happen to identify with. So you are biologically a male, you think of yourself as masculine, and oftentimes that just happens by what you've been assigned. But of course your parents and your guardians, whoever is raising you, will also have a lot to do with that. So if your parents, give you a female name, they dress you up in dresses, they make your hair grow long, all those kinds of things, your parents can have a big difference on what your gender is. Other people's perceptions have a lot to do with your gender. So it's not just what you're trying to present, but it's what people are imposing upon you that determines what your gender is. Then of course there's the internal gender identity. It's the identity that you feel that you have, whether you are male or female or somewhere in between, or even something that's not male or female, either one. There can also be pressure or violence. In a number of different cultures, it's dangerous for somebody to not go along with the gender patterns that are sort of the cultural norm. And oftentimes that can lead to violence. So what we would potentially call sexual harassment, what we would call gay bashing, any of those kinds of things can be related to one's gender. And whether you stick to your assigned gender, what your biological sex might determine, is in large part sometimes dictated by whatever kind of pressure or violence you might be under. And of course, people have religious beliefs, cultural beliefs, and ethnic beliefs that dictate what your gender is going to be like. If you happen to be in a religion that has very strict gender roles, and many of them do, most of the major ones have very strict gender roles, how you display that gender and whether you feel capable of going outside of that gender can be dictated by those particular beliefs. And of course, to some degree, there is some preference involved in gender. People can play with gendered aspects of themselves. So for instance, men can display very feminine kinds of gender roles, for instance, in a drag show. They may not think of themselves as a transgendered person. That's not their gender identity inside, but it's a practice or a preference that they have for playing with their gender and dressing up as the quote-unquote opposite gender. So there's some really important things to think about, some really important terms that have to do with one's gender and how it is determined on an individual basis. One thing, as we talked about a few minutes ago, is gender identity. What is it you feel within yourself? So for transgender people, they feel that their gender identity is not one that matches their external appearance or their biological sex. You'll oftentimes hear it described as being trapped in a different body than the one you're supposed to have. So this gender identity is the one that is internal to you. Then there's gender expression, and this can be very different from gender identity. Gender identity, again, is the inside. Gender expression is the outside. So I might wear very male clothes, but maybe inside I don't feel like a male. Maybe I feel like a female. For those people who are transgender, again, they may, for many years, have a gender expression that goes along with their biological sex, even though their gender identity says that they are not that sex. And the transitioning process for transgender people is one from changing their gender expression to fit their gender identity. Some people are gender creative, so they're not trapped in a binary per se between male and female, and it might not just be that they're in the opposite gender expression from their gender identity, right, which is still a very binary way of thinking. Some people are able to mix and match various gender things together, and this is what we might call gender creative or gender fluid, where you can take pieces of various genders and put them together, or have no gender at all, what we might call agender. Non-binary gender is another good term for this. As we've said, this notion of masculine or feminine can have a lot of gray area in between, a lot of play in between, a lot of fluidity in between. So someone who has a non-binary gender might be able to actually like mix and match things in terms of gender fluidity, but also might change over time. They might be male at some times and female at other times. Or, excuse me, masculine at some times and feminine at other times. So if we think about how society handles people who are male or female, sometimes we run into what we call sexism, which is a preference for or a belief in the superiority of one particular sex over another. Oftentimes this is related to power dynamics. So if there are males who believe that females can't do something, for instance, that they're not strong enough to be a firefighter or a police person, that sexism would say that that biological component makes someone incapable of doing it. Or there might be discrimination for hiring, pay, housing, medical care, interaction that has to do with a preference for or belief in the superiority of one sex over the other. Another term that'll come up a lot, and it's already come up in our discussion so far, is the notion of transgender. Oftentimes in the past, this might have been known by a number of other names. This is the preferred term currently, the notion of transgender, making a transition from one gender expression to another gender expression, usually for the purpose of making one's gender expression match with their gender identity. Now, the other term for someone who already matches their gender identity, gender expression, and their biological sex is someone who is cisgender. This is a bit of a newer term, but one that you hear much more often nowadays. So if you are born a male and your gender identity is male and your gender expression is male, you are considered cisgender. So let's just stop for a moment thinking about these terms and just remember a kind of fundamental principle, or make explicit this fundamental principle that I've been talking about throughout this discussion of the terms, that gender and sexuality are not fixed. So even if your gender starts as congruent with your biological sex, over time that can be quite different. And that can happen for people at many different stages of their life. The same goes for sexuality, and I'll talk a little bit more about sexuality and how that's different from gender and sex. But even sexuality is not something that's fixed over time. People can go in and out of different sexualities and come back and forth between their sexualities as they go through life. So we have to remember this fundamental principle. Gender and sexuality are not fixed. So I want to look now at thinking about the social again rather than just the individual. So a lot of what's gone on in the terms before are terms for what an individual is feeling or doing, and how an individual is born may change over time. But thinking about the social field of gender, because gender is not just something that happens within a person, it's something that the sources of it are society, culture, ethnicity, religion, all those kinds of things. Gender regime is a term that we use for the prevailing gender norms of a particular society. And what we are talking about, particularly when we use this word regime, that word has kind of a connotation for most English speakers of dealing with power. And definitely that's what's going on here as well, that for gender within a society at a particular time, a particular place. There's a power structure that goes along with this gender regime. And there are people who are invested in having to keep this regime in place. And there are people who are disadvantaged by the regime that is in place. So that's gender regime, and you'll see that come up a few times here or there throughout the readings. So we've talked about sex, the biological component. We've talked about gender, which is the social component that feeds from the biological. Let's look at the other major term that comes along with the gender and sexuality course. Sexuality is, in some senses, a combination of sex and gender. Your sexuality, in part, comes from the parts that you were born with. So there are certain limitations that one might have based on or certain possibilities that one might have based on the actual sex parts, the biological parts that someone has. But there's a lot more to do with sexuality than just the physical act of penises and vaginas and rectums and mouths and all sorts of other parts interacting with each other. So we want to talk a little bit about not only practices, but also sexuality as a construct. So if we think about what determines one's sexuality, we talked about what determines one's sex, we talked about what determines one's gender, but what is it about sexuality? Well, there's, of course, sexual attraction, right? Who you look at and say, oh, I would like to have sex with that person. Wouldn't it be interesting to have sex with that person? There's also sexual practices, the actual things that you do with other people's sexual genitalia and that kind of thing. But there's also romantic attraction, an emotional attraction, like what sort of person can you fall in love with? What kind of person can you have sort of emotional connection with? Who do you like to sort of listen to and talk to and relate with, and those kinds of things. So all sorts of different components to sexuality beyond just the actual physical act of having sex with another person or other people. Then, of course, there's history. What determines one's sexuality, in part, is what one has done in the past. But this changes over time. So again, you might start life sexually attracted to men, but then become sexually attracted to women, and then later on maybe become sexually attracted to both. Your sexual practices may include partners of multiple sexes, multiple genders. You may have romantic and emotional attachments at one point in your life that are very different from what happens at other points in your life. So again, sexuality is not fixed. Those kinds of characteristics of your sexuality can change over time. So what are some of the various sexualities that we can talk about and identify when we do research? Well, one is homosexual. That is when you are attracted to someone of the same sex as you are. So again, biological. If a male and another male are attracted and sexual together, that is homosexual. If a female and another female are attracted and sexual with one another, that is also homosexual. Then there's heterosexual. This is the dominant sexuality in our society. We have males and females, biological males and biological females, who have sexual intercourse together and have romantic attractions and emotional attractions and those kinds of things. That's heterosexual. Then there's bisexual. There's someone who is bisexual, has physical, emotional, maybe spiritual attraction to both males and females. Again, sex. Then, of course, there's also asexual, and a lot of people may not have heard about asexuality, but this is a person who has no sexual or romantic or emotional attraction to either sex. Someone who has no interest in it and no real sort of emotional connection that has a sexual nature. Then there are people who are polyamorous. So people who might be in love with multiple people, consensually attracted to multiple people at the same time. Now, when we think about sexuality, particularly for homosexuality or bisexuality, an important concept is the notion of coming out. And the sort of longer phrase derives from coming out of the closet being the notion that one's sexuality, especially non-heterosexuality, had to be hidden from others. It had to be in the closet, so to speak. So coming out is a process of informing other people of one's sexuality. And an important thing to remember is that this is a process. It's not just necessarily, that someone comes out and they are just out with everyone. That people who are going to come out to various individuals at various different times, or maybe not at all, because there are real threats to one's standing, one's economic situation, one's employment, housing, medical care, all those kinds of things are potentially threatened in our society by people who don't like or don't understand or fear homosexuals. Now, this is a kind of paired concept is a notion of being outed. So of one person telling others about someone else's sexuality. This is a really problematic kind of thing to out other people because of those same kinds of dangers and threats that I was just talking about. For gender, an important concept is pronouns. In English, one of the major ways that we distinguish between the biological sexes and the genders within language is by using pronouns. So we say she for females, her, hers, he for males, him, his. But people who don't conform to that binary terminology may use different kinds of pronouns. They may use they or them or theirs for an individual, which can be difficult for people who are just learning about how these terms are being used, how pronouns are being used. But it's really important to use the pronouns that people want you to use for them. So you might talk about an individual as they. They came over to my house and gave me their book. Some other alternatives include Z, here, here's, and there's many, many others. So oftentimes I think it's a good practice to ask people what pronouns they'd like to use, share the pronouns that you would like used for yourself, and particularly for people who are cisgender, who, remember, are people who their gender expression and their gender identity and their biological sex align. Saying what pronouns you prefer takes away some of the stigma from people who are not using the sort of standard pronouns and making it easier for them. Intersectionality is a key term in gender studies, and it's a term that since about 2000 has really grown in popularity. It's basically the notion that your gender and your sexuality, your sex, your race, your class, your body size, your political persuasions, your religion, all of these things intersect and can make really complicated ways of life for a particular individual, so that you can't really distinguish, what part of your experience is related to your race, what part is related to gender, what part is related to sexuality, because they're so merged together and they interact with each other that it becomes complicated. So if you think about, for instance, queer people of color, so non-heterosexual people of color have a lot of issues going on in terms of their sexuality, but also their race. So even within communities of color, that sexuality piece can be very, very difficult because of those intersections of oppressions, those intersections of complications that may impact their lives. Now, privilege is another concept that's very much related. So within all of these gender regimes of sexuality, and the system of sex and sexism, certain people have privilege or get certain perks in society that other people are denied. So there are male privileges, there are heterosexual privileges, there are cisgender privileges that all come from being born or identifying or expressing yourself in particular ways. So it's special rights or advantages that people would get. So one social privilege that we might talk about is heterosexism. This is a sexuality privilege, the assumption that other people are heterosexual, or the belief that heterosexuality is the norm, should be the norm, or should be rewarded in people, or that the lack of heterosexuality should be a disadvantage for people. Compulsory heterosexuality. This is the concept that heterosexuality will be enforced by society. In certain cultures, you can be arrested, fired from your job, even killed or beaten for being non-heterosexual. So the notion of compulsory heterosexuality is talking about gender regimes and sexuality regimes that enforce people being heterosexual. One of the driving components of compulsory heterosexuality is oftentimes homophobia. These are thoughts, feelings, or actions that are based on fear, dislike, judgment, or hatred of lesbians, gays, and bisexuals. This could be violence, it could be prejudice, it could be discrimination, and it could be the withholding of privileges or even oppressions. Very similar is transphobia. All of those same kinds of dangers and discriminations of homophobia, but in this case, subjected to transgender people. So transphobia is the fear, hatred, rejection, or misunderstanding of transgendered people. Now, we might talk about people who are heterosexist, sexist, transphobic, homophobic, but there's also a lot of people out there who would fall under the notion of ally. So this is the term, generally speaking, of cisgender or heterosexual people who support and respect members of the LGBTQ community. And this is also a term that can be used for men who are in support of women's issues. One thing that I think I've found has been really helpful in thinking about all of these various interactions of terminology is a diagram called the genderbread person. Now this is a bit of a controversial diagram for a number of different reasons. If you're interested in the controversy, you're more than welcome to read more about it, but Sam Kellerman, who you'll also watch a video from, has created this diagram that is widely popular. So looking at all of the various components of gender identity, gender expression, biological sex, and sexual and romantic attraction that go on in an individual, and being able to kind of see the intersections of all these things. So this really interesting diagram. The genderbread person that you'll actually see there looks like a gingerbread person, looking at identity that happens within the brain, attraction that happens within the heart, expression that is sort of on the outside of the body, and then sex, which they've located sort of around the genitals, but which you'll remember we talked about earlier is really sort of all over the body in terms of hormones, chromosomes, hair, all those kinds of things. There's also some interesting parts of the diagram that talk about the sort of fluidness and the range idea that we were talking about before. So within each person, one's gender identity might be more or less feminine, more or less masculine, and it kind of goes on those particular scales. Gender expression is the same thing. One can express oneself in very masculine ways or very feminine ways, or a kind of mixture of those things in certain situations, or in certain ways someone might be quite feminine, and other ways they might be quite masculine. So someone might have a very feminine voice, but a very masculine physique, and that might be different ways of doing gender expression. Of course, biological sex can also be on a kind of sliding scale, if you will. So those physical sex characteristics, genitalia, body shape, voice pitch, all those kinds of things can be variously female or male in the same individual. In terms of sexual attraction, you can be sexually attracted to nobody, again, asexual. You can be sexually attracted to women, females, or femininity. An important kind of distinction I think that he makes there, this notion that you can be attracted to someone sexually because of their sex, because of their gender, or because of their actual gender expression. And the same thing for romantic attraction. You can be romantically attracted to no one, or you can be romantically attracted to women, females, and femininity, or men, males, and masculinity, and various levels of that within the same individual. So I urge you to take a look again at this genderbread person. You can look it up at, it's pronounced metrosexual.com, and he updates it quite frequently. But these are, the preceding video have been the terms and concepts that are going to be very basic to the content that we'll talk about in the Gender and Sexuality course. But also for those of you who might not be in that course who are watching this and are interested in studying gender and sexuality, these are some really important terms that it's good to know. I would urge you to maybe watch the video a second time and really try to get a firm grasp on what these terms mean and all of the various complications that are involved in understanding the multiple ways that gender, sex, and sexuality can be practiced and can be found in our society. Thanks very much for listening. I hope to see you soon.